I had always believed that money defined a person. If you were rich, you mattered. If you weren't, you didn't. That was just how the world worked, or so I thought. That evening, I was having dinner at Le Chateau Royal, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. The kind of place where the chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, and the waiters moved like silent shadows, attending to every need before you even realized you had one. I had been invited to a high-profile networking event, and as always, I dressed to impress. A silk designer gown, diamond earrings, and a clutch that probably cost more than the waiter's monthly salary. Speaking of the waiter, he was young, maybe in his late 20s, with sharp features and deep brown eyes. His uniform was crisp, but something about his posture felt different. He didn't grovel like the others. There was a quiet dignity about him that I didn't like. It made me uncomfortable. He served my table with precision, refilling my glass at the perfect moment, never interrupting conversations, always poised. But when the bill came, I felt no obligation to tip him. After all, it was his job to serve me. I had already paid for the meal. When he placed the receipt in front of me, I simply signed it and pushed it back without adding anything extra. He glanced at the empty tip line, then at me. For the briefest moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it disappointment? Amusement? I didn't care. "Is there a problem?" I asked coolly. He smiled, a polite, unreadable smile. "No, ma'am. Thank you for dining with us." And just like that, he walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I had no idea our paths would cross again, and when they did, I was the one left speechless. A week later, I received an invitation to the Black Diamond Gala, an event attended only by the wealthiest and most influential people in the city. It was where millionaires and billionaires gathered to celebrate their success, strike deals, and showcase their status. This was the kind of event where you had to be seen. It was more than just a party. It was a statement. The ballroom was breathtaking, decorated with towering floral arrangements and golden chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd. The scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the sound of soft classical music. Waiters moved gracefully, serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres to guests who barely acknowledged them. I was in my element. I floated through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands with CEOs, and charming my way into conversations that mattered. Everything was perfect, until the moment my eyes landed on him. For a second, my breath caught in my throat. The waiter. But he wasn't a waiter tonight. He stood near the center of the room, dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo, a glass of champagne in his hand, engaged in conversation with a group of wealthy investors. People weren't ignoring him, they were listening to him, respecting him. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things. How was this possible? Then, as if sensing my stare, he turned. Our eyes met, and that's when it happened. He smirked, a slow, knowing smirk that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a strange mix of confusion and panic. Who was he? And more importantly, what was he doing here? My heart pounded in my chest as he took a slow sip of his champagne, his gaze never leaving mine. I tried to mask my shock, lifting my chin slightly, but I could feel the heat rising in my face. This didn't make sense. A week ago, he was a waiter. A nobody. And yet, here he was, effortlessly blending in with the city's wealthiest elite. I needed answers. Forcing a polite smile, I made my way toward him, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace. He saw me approaching, but made no move to acknowledge me. Instead, he continued his conversation with the investors, speaking with quiet confidence. I finally stopped beside him, waiting for him to turn. The moment stretched longer than I expected. Was he ignoring me? Me? Clearing my throat, I spoke, keeping my tone light but firm. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." He finally turned, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Oh, but we have," he said smoothly. "A week ago, at Le Chateau Royal." I swallowed hard. He wasn't going to make this easy. "You were my waiter," I said as if I needed to remind him. He tilted his head slightly. "I was." I waited for an explanation. But he simply let the words hang in the air, like he was enjoying my confusion. My patience wore thin. "So, what exactly are you doing here?" He chuckled softly, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Networking, of course. Just like you." Before I could press further, a well-dressed older gentleman approached and clapped him on the back. "There you are. I've been meaning to introduce you to my associates." The man turned to the group, gesturing toward him. Everyone, meet Daniel Carter, the newest partner at Carter & Reynolds Investments. My stomach dropped. Carter & Reynolds Investments, a firm so powerful it practically ran half the financial world. And he was a partner? I could barely process it. I felt like the ground had just shifted beneath me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't feel any smaller, Daniel turned back to me, his smirk deepening. You didn't think I was just a waiter, did you? I could feel my pulse in my ears. A slow, sinking realization settled in my chest. I had judged him, dismissed him, and now, standing before me as a powerful investor, he knew it. For the first time in a long time, I felt small. I forced a polite laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. Well, this is certainly unexpected. I just assumed that I was beneath you, he interrupted smoothly, raising an eyebrow. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my tongue. I had thought that. And we both knew it. He held my gaze for a long moment before flashing an easy smile, turning his attention back to the investors. He was done with me. Just like that. I should have walked away, pretended I didn't care. But my pride wouldn't let me. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. If you're so wealthy, why were you working as a waiter? His lips curved in amusement, but his eyes held something sharper. I like to understand people, he said simply, how they treat others when they think they have nothing to gain. His words hit me like a slap. I stiffened. And what did you learn? He took another slow sip of his champagne, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make me squirm. That wealth doesn't always equal class, he said finally. I felt my face burn. He wasn't just calling me out, he was exposing me. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong. Before I could find a response, the older investor clapped him on the shoulder again. Come, Daniel. There are some people you must meet. He gave me one last knowing look before turning away, disappearing into the sea of powerful people. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the most important person in the room. I stood there, frozen, as laughter and conversation swirled around me, my hands clenched around the delicate stem of my champagne glass, my carefully crafted confidence slipping. Daniel Carter had tested me, and I had failed. I replayed our interaction over and over in my mind, the way I had dismissed him at the restaurant, the way I had assumed he was just another faceless worker, the way I had treated him as if he didn't matter. And now, the power had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being admired. I was the one being judged. Swallowing my pride, I scanned the room, searching for him. He stood near the grand staircase, speaking to a group of influential guests, his presence effortlessly commanding attention. I took a deep breath and made my way over. As I approached, I could feel the weight of his gaze before I even spoke. The conversation around him paused as I cleared my throat. Daniel, I said, my voice softer this time. May I have a word? A few of the investors exchanged curious glances, but Daniel simply studied me for a moment before nodding. Excuse me, gentlemen, he said smoothly, stepping aside with me. I hesitated. Apologizing wasn't something I was used to, but tonight I had no choice. I was wrong, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. About you, about a lot of things. A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise? Amusement? I couldn't tell. He folded his arms. Go on. I exhaled sharply. I misjudged you, and I treated you unfairly at Adrat. I assumed things without knowing the full story. I swallowed my pride and forced out the words I had never said to anyone before. I'm sorry. For the first time that night, his smirk faded. The teasing amusement in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something quieter, something more real. His expression softened, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. You know, he said after a pause, his voice lower now, more thoughtful, I wasn't angry that you didn't tip me. I felt a flicker of confusion, my brows knit together. You weren't? He shook his head slowly, his gaze steady, unwavering. No, he said, his tone calm but firm. What bothered me was that you didn't even see me. To you, I wasn't a person, I was just part of the background. The words landed with unexpected weight, cutting through my defenses in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had expected him to resent me for the money, to be bitter about the missing tip. But this was different. This wasn't about money at all. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the stem of my champagne glass. Had I really been that blind? I had spent years perfecting my image, building a life where people knew my name, where doors opened for me with a single glance. But in all that time, how many people had I looked through instead of looking at? How many moments had I dismissed simply because I thought they didn't matter? For all the wealth I had accumulated, for all the power and prestige I had chased, I had been oblivious to something simple yet profound. Respect isn't about money. It's about character. And at that moment, standing before Daniel Carter, the man I had ignored, the man who now stood in a room full of the world's most powerful people, I realized something painful but necessary. I had failed the simplest test of all. For the first time that night, I felt something unexpected. Not shame, not embarrassment, but growth. It was a strange feeling, one I wasn't used to. I had spent years believing that success meant being admired, feared, or envied. But tonight, standing in front of Daniel, I realized that true power wasn't about wealth or status. It was about character. I let out a slow breath, the weight of my realization settling deep in my chest. How many people had I overlooked? How many moments had I wasted thinking only about myself? I met his gaze, my voice quieter this time. I understand now. A pause stretched between us, filled with something unspoken. Not tension, not resentment, but a quiet acknowledgement. He had seen the change in me, even if he wasn't saying it out loud. Then, to my surprise, Daniel chuckled. It wasn't mocking or bitter, just a low, amused sound, as if he had expected this moment all along. "Well," he said, his lips curling into that familiar smirk, "I guess I should say, you're welcome." I blinked. For what? He tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was a puzzle he had just solved. Then, with effortless confidence, he said, "For the lesson." The words hit me deeper than I cared to admit. He had walked into my life as a waiter and left as someone I would never forget. He had humbled me, challenged me, and forced me to see beyond my narrow world. And just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of powerful, important people. But this time, I didn't feel dismissed. I didn't feel insulted. This time, I felt changed, because for the first time in my life, I had learned something priceless, and it didn't cost a single dollar. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Like this video if you enjoyed the storytelling. Comment your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think about the twist. Share this with your friends so they can experience the journey too. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Your support keeps these stories coming.